Rich man forces black waitress to play his piano to mock her, but her talent leaves everyone speechless. The Bellamy estate sparkled like a diamond against the midnight sky, every window ablaze with golden light that spilled across manicured lawns worth more than most people's homes. Valets in crisp uniforms guided Maseratis and Bentleys through wrought iron gates that had probably cost more than Nina's entire college education. String lights danced over perfectly sculpted hedges, casting shadows that seemed to whisper secrets only the wealthy were allowed to hear. Nina Washington adjusted her black uniform for the 100th time that evening, her fingers trembling slightly as she balanced the silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes. Each glass probably cost more than her monthly rent in the cramped studio apartment she shared with her younger sister, Maya. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, serving champagne that cost hundreds of dollars a bottle to people who wouldn't notice if she disappeared tomorrow. The marble ballroom stretched before her like an ocean of privilege, its polished floor reflecting the enormous crystal chandelier that hung overhead like a frozen firework. In the corner, positioned like a throne for the gods of music, sat a sleek black grand piano, a Steinway that Nina recognized immediately. Her fingers ached just looking at it. She hadn't played a real piano in 3 years, not since she'd been forced to drop out of Juilliard when her mother got sick. "Focus, Nina," she whispered to herself, forcing her attention back to the tray in her hands. She couldn't afford to mess this up. Not tonight. Not when Maya needed new textbooks and their landlord was already breathing down their necks about late rent. The city's elite mingled around her like exotic birds, their laughter as artificial as their smiles. Women draped in diamonds worth small fortunes picked at caviar they probably couldn't even taste anymore, while men in $1,000 suits discussed stock portfolios and yacht purchases with the same casual indifference they might show discussing the weather. "Nina." Marco's voice cut through the ambient chatter, and she turned to see her only real friend on the catering staff approaching with a worried expression. Marco Rodriguez had been working these high society events for 5 years, and he'd become something of a protective older brother to her since she'd started 6 months ago. His weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a man who'd worked hard for everything he had, just like her. "What's wrong?" she asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. Marco glanced over his shoulder toward a corner table where several men in expensive suits were gathered around bottles of top-shelf scotch. "Stay clear of that corner table," he warned under his breath, his dark eyes serious. "Bellamy's already on his third scotch, and you know how he gets when he's been drinking." Nina's stomach clenched. She'd heard the stories about Grayson Bellamy, the real estate mogul who owned half the city's most expensive properties and had a reputation for treating service staff like entertainment. He was the kind of man who'd never heard the word no in his life, the kind who believed his money gave him the right to humiliate anyone he deemed beneath him. "I can handle myself," Nina said, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt a chill run down her spine. "I know you can," Marco replied, his voice softening. "But some battles aren't worth fighting, Mija. Not when your paycheck depends on keeping your head down." Nina nodded, but inside, her heart was racing. She'd been keeping her head down her entire life, working double shifts to pay for her mother's cancer treatments, sacrificing her dreams to keep food on the table, smiling politely while customers at the diner back home made comments about her skin color or assumed she was too stupid to understand their conversations. Sometimes she wondered if she'd ever stop running from fights she was too afraid to start. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her years of dance training evident in the way she navigated between clusters of guests without disturbing their conversations. The tray remained perfectly steady in her hands despite the tremor of anxiety that had started in her chest and was now spreading through her entire body. "Excuse me, miss." A woman with platinum blonde hair and a necklace that could probably fund a small country's healthcare system stopped her. "Could I have another champagne? And make sure it's properly chilled this time." "Of course, ma'am," Nina replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd learned long ago that the trick to surviving these events was to become invisible, to serve efficiently and disappear before anyone could find fault with her presence. But as she turned away from the blonde woman, she realized with growing dread that she was being watched. She could feel eyes on her, studying her movements with the kind of predatory interest that made her skin crawl. Slowly, She raised her gaze and found herself looking directly at Grayson Bellamy. He sat at the corner table Marco had warned her about, his signature white suit immaculate despite the late hour. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, from his perfectly styled silver hair to the gold watch that probably cost more than her family had ever seen. But it was his eyes that made Nina's blood run cold. They held the kind of calculating malice that came from a lifetime of getting away with cruelty simply because he could afford to. Bellamy raised two fingers in her direction, a gesture so casual and dismissive that it made Nina's jaw clench. The conversations around his table began to quiet as other guests noticed the interaction. She could feel the weight of dozens of gazes settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. There was no escape now. Marco was across the room, helping another server with a spilled tray. The other staff members had suddenly found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. Nina was alone, standing in the middle of a marble ballroom surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than furniture with legs. She walked toward Bellamy's table with measured steps, her spine straight and her expression carefully neutral. Each step felt like walking toward an execution, but she refused to let her fear show. She'd learned early in life that showing weakness to men like Grayson Bellamy was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "Yes, sir," she said when she reached his table, her voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions swirling in her chest. Bellamy leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "You've got that sway in your step," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry to the nearby tables. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The entire corner of the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Nina blinked, confusion mixing with the growing sense of dread in her stomach. "I beg your pardon." "The way you move," Bellamy continued, gesturing lazily with his scotch glass. "Like you've got music in your bones. Tell me, sweetheart, can you play as well as you walk?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Nina felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. She glanced around the table and noticed for the first time that one of the men seated beside Bellamy wasn't laughing along with the others. Charles Wyndham, the director of the National Arts Foundation, sat with his brows slightly furrowed, his usually stoic expression troubled. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Nina said, though deep down, she understood perfectly. This was the moment she'd been dreading since she started working these events. The moment when someone decided to turn her into their evening's entertainment. The piano. Bellamy gestured toward the beautiful Steinway in the corner, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Let's hear something soulful. Entertain us." The room chuckled nervously, the sound like breaking glass in Nina's ears. Someone at a nearby table muttered, "Grayson," in a tone that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd witnessed his cruelty. Nina's heart began to pound so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her palms grew sweaty around the tray, and for a moment, she felt like she might faint. This was her worst nightmare coming true, being singled out, humiliated, forced to perform like a trained animal for the amusement of people who would never see her as an equal. But something else was happening too. Deep in her chest, beneath the fear and humiliation, she felt a familiar fire beginning to kindle. It was the same fire that had driven her to practice piano for hours every day as a child, even when her neighbors complained about the noise. The same fire that had pushed her to audition for Juilliard despite her family's protests that it was a waste of time for someone like her. "She's working, sir." Marco's voice cut through the tension as he appeared at Nina's side, his jaw set with determination. "Maybe let the musicians handle the entertainment." Nina felt a surge of gratitude toward her friend, but she could see the concern in his eyes. They both knew that challenging Grayson Bellamy could cost them their jobs, and they both needed those jobs desperately. "I asked her," Bellamy interrupted coldly, his mask of false friendliness slipping to reveal the predator underneath. "She looks like she's got a song in her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Nina could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, could practically hear the thoughts running through their minds. Some were probably enjoying the spectacle. Others might have felt uncomfortable but wouldn't risk their social standing to intervene. A few might have even felt sorry for her, but not sorry enough to actually help. "Consider this a tip," Bellamy added with a laugh that made Nina's skin crawl. Marco stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Let her be, Grayson." But Nina barely heard him. Something had shifted inside her, like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for years. She looked at Grayson Bellamy, this man who thought he could humiliate her for sport, and felt her fear transform into something much more dangerous. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her silver tray on a nearby table. The clink of crystal against marble seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. Every eye followed her movement as she walked toward the piano, her steps measured and purposeful. She didn't walk like a servant anymore. She walked like someone who owned not just the bench, but the entire room. Nina sat down at the piano bench and ran her fingers over the smooth keys without pressing them. The Steinway was perfectly tuned. She could tell just from the touch. For a moment, she was 19 again, sitting in the practice rooms at Juilliard with the whole world spread out before her like an unwritten symphony. "I don't play for tips," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. Grayson smirked, raising his scotch glass in a mock toast. "Good. I wasn't planning to give you any." The cruelty in his voice was like a match to gasoline. Nina cracked her knuckles, a habit from her conservatory days, and closed her eyes. For a moment, she let herself forget where she was, forget the humiliation that had brought her to this moment. She let herself remember who she used to be before life forced her to become small and invisible. When her fingers touched the keys, the first notes that emerged weren't jazz, weren't classical, weren't anything that could be categorized or contained. They were pure emotion given voice. Every disappointment, every sacrifice, every dream deferred pouring out through her fingertips. The melody started soft and mournful, like a lament for all the opportunities she'd lost. But then it began to build, gaining strength and complexity as she let years of suppressed passion flow freely. Her left hand found a rhythm that spoke of resilience, of a spirit that refused to be broken no matter how many times it had been beaten down. The music swelled and danced, defiant and beautiful, telling the story of a girl who'd been forced to put away her dreams but had never forgotten how to dream. It spoke of late nights spent practicing scales while her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. It sang of the moment she'd held her Juilliard acceptance letter in her trembling hands, knowing she'd never be able to accept it. It cried for all the songs that had lived inside her with no outlet, no audience except the walls of her tiny apartment. But most of all, it proclaimed that she was still here, still fighting, still worthy of respect and recognition, no matter what uniform she wore or what job she worked to survive. The final notes hung in the air like stars, beautiful and unreachable. When the silence finally broke, Nina opened her eyes to find every person in the ballroom staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to awe to something that might have been shame. And Grayson Bellamy, the man who had orchestrated this humiliation for his own amusement? He couldn't meet her eyes. But Marco could. He was the first to break the stunned silence, his applause echoing through the ballroom like thunder. Then Charles Wyndham stood, something the reserve director of the National Arts Foundation almost never did in public, and his applause joined Marco's. "That," Wyndham said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated his life to recognizing true artistry, "was art." As other guests began to applaud, some reluctantly, others with genuine enthusiasm, Nina remained seated at the piano bench. Her heart was racing, but not with fear anymore. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. Not the invisible waitress, not the girl who'd been forced to give up her dreams, but Nina Washington, the pianist who had once been told she had the potential to change the world with her music. She had no way of knowing it yet, but this moment, this act of defiance disguised as submission, was about to change everything. Because Charles Wyndham wasn't just any audience member, and he had just witnessed something that would haunt him until he did something about it. The story of Nina Washington was just beginning. 3 days after the Bellamy Estate incident, Nina stood in the cramped kitchen of her studio apartment, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug that had seen better years. The morning sun filtered through the single window, casting long shadows across the tiny space she shared with her 22-year-old sister, Maya. The walls were thin enough that she could hear Mrs. Patterson next door arguing with her teenage son about his music being too loud, an irony that wasn't lost on her, considering she hadn't touched a piano key since that night. Maya emerged from behind the folding screen that served as their bedroom divider, her nursing student uniform wrinkled from being hastily pulled on. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of another late night spent studying for her upcoming licensing exam. The exam that would determine whether all their sacrifices had been worth it. "You're up early," Maya said, grabbing a piece of toast from the counter. "Thought you didn't have to work until this afternoon." Nina stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise like tiny ghosts. She hadn't told Maya about what happened at the Bellamy estate. How could she explain that for 3 minutes, she'd felt like the person she used to be, only to wake up the next morning back in the same life that felt too small for her soul? "Couldn't sleep," Nina replied, which was true enough. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the echo of those piano notes, felt the weight of Charles Wyndham's stare, remembered the moment when an entire room full of people had seen her as something more than furniture. Maya studied her sister's face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd learned to read emotional weather patterns out of necessity. "You've been weird since Monday night. What happened at that fancy party?" "Nothing happened," Nina lied, taking a sip of coffee that tasted like bitter truth. "Just rich people being rich people." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't nothing. Marco had called her yesterday, his voice tight with concern. Word was spreading through the catering company about the incident at Bellamy's. Some of the other servers were calling her crazy for what she'd done. Others were calling her brave. The manager, Mrs. Chun, had asked to speak with her before her next shift, and Nina's stomach churned every time she thought about what that conversation might bring. Maya grabbed her backpack, stuffing textbooks and highlighters into the already overstuffed bag. "Well, whatever it was, you need to shake it off. We can't afford for you to lose focus right now." She paused at the door, her expression softening. "I know this isn't the life you planned, Nina, but it's temporary. Once I graduate and get a job at the hospital, things will be different." Nina nodded, forcing a smile. "I know. Go ace that study session." After Maya left, the apartment felt even smaller. Nina walked to the corner where her old keyboard sat covered by a bedsheet. A cheap Yamaha she'd bought secondhand when she first moved to the city, back when she still believed she might find a way to continue her music education. She pulled back the sheet and stared at the keys, her fingers itching to play. But the walls were too thin, and Mrs. Patterson was already complaining about noise. Besides, what was the point? Playing that keyboard after experiencing the Steinway at Bellamy's was like trying to paint a masterpiece with children's crayons. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marco, "Meeting with Chun in an hour. I'll be there with you. Don't worry." Nina's stomach dropped. She'd been hoping to have more time to prepare for whatever consequences were coming. But deep down, she'd known this was inevitable. You didn't embarrass someone like Grayson Bellamy in front of his peers without paying a price. An hour later, Nina sat in the stark office of Prestige Catering Services, her hands folded in her lap as Mrs. Chun reviewed a file that Nina assumed contained her employment records. Marco sat beside her, his jaw set with the same protective determination he'd shown at the party. Mrs. Chun was a small woman in her 50s who had built her catering business from nothing through sheer determination and an uncompromising attention to detail. She ran her company like a military operation, and Nina had always respected her professionalism, which made this conversation all the more terrifying. "Miss Washington," Mrs. Chun began, her voice carefully neutral, "I've received several phone calls about your conduct at the Bellamy event Monday night." Nina's heart sank. "Mrs. Chun, I can explain." Mrs. Chun held up a hand. "Before you say anything, let me tell you what I've heard. I've heard that you provided entertainment for the guests that was." She paused, consulting her notes. "Extraordinary and deeply moving." Nina blinked in confusion. This wasn't what she'd expected. "I've also heard," Mrs. Chun continued, "that you conducted yourself with dignity in a situation that was, frankly, inappropriate and unprofessional. Not on your part, on the part of the host." Marco leaned forward. "Mrs. Chun, if there's going to be fallout from this, it should come to me. I should have intervened sooner." "There's no fallout, Mr. Rodriguez," Mrs. Chun said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "In fact, quite the opposite. I've received 3 requests from other clients specifically asking for Miss Washington to work their events. Apparently, word has spread through certain circles that we have someone on staff with exceptional talents." Nina felt like the floor had shifted beneath her. "I don't understand." Mrs. Chin set down her file and looked directly at Nina. "Miss Washington, in my 20 years of running this business, I've learned to recognize quality when I see it. What you did Monday night, turning a moment of humiliation into something beautiful. That takes a rare kind of strength and talent. She paused. Would you be interested in taking on some additional responsibilities? Perhaps coordinating entertainment for some of our higher-end events? I, I don't know what to say, Nina stammered. Say yes, Marco muttered under his breath, grinning. The position would come with a significant raise, Mrs. Chen added, and more regular hours. I understand you have family obligations. Nina's mind raced. More money would mean catching up on rent, buying Maya's textbooks without having to choose between them and groceries, maybe even saving a little for the future. But it also meant more exposure to people like Grace and Bellamy, more opportunities for humiliation and condescension. Can I think about it? Nina asked. Of course, but don't take too long. The Pemberton anniversary party is next week, and they've specifically requested you. As they left Mrs. Chen's office, Marco couldn't contain his excitement. Nina, this is amazing. Do you know what this means? It means I'll still be serving rich people who see me as entertainment, Nina replied. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Something had shifted Monday night, something she couldn't quite name. It means, Marco said, stopping in the parking lot and turning to face her, that you're finally being seen for who you really are. Nina wanted to believe him, but as she drove home through the city streets, past the gleaming towers of downtown, where people like Grace and Bellamy made their fortunes, she couldn't shake the feeling that being seen came with its own kind of danger. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Charles Wyndham was sitting in his corner office at the National Arts Foundation, staring at a business card he'd been carrying in his wallet since Monday night. On it was written Nina Washington in his own careful handwriting, along with her phone number that he'd discreetly obtained from the catering company. He'd made a career out of discovering and nurturing exceptional talent. And what he'd witnessed at the Bellamy estate was the kind of raw, undeniable artistry that came along perhaps once in a decade. The question was whether Nina Washington was ready for what he was about to offer her, and whether she was prepared for how dramatically her life was about to change. Because Charles Wyndham didn't just hand out business cards. He changed lives. And Nina Washington's life was about to become something entirely different from what she'd ever imagined possible. The phone on his desk seemed to mock him as he picked it up, then set it down again. Some conversations, he knew, required perfect timing. And for Nina Washington, that timing was coming sooner than anyone expected. 2 weeks had passed since Nina accepted Mrs. Chen's offer, and she was beginning to find her rhythm in her new role. The Pemberton anniversary party had been a success. She'd coordinated a string quartet and managed to stay invisible while ensuring everything ran smoothly. No one had asked her to perform, and she'd been grateful for the anonymity. But the money was better, and for the first time in months, Nina had been able to pay rent without anxiety gnawing at her stomach. Maya had even commented that Nina seemed lighter somehow, though Nina wasn't sure she agreed. She felt more like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Nina was reviewing vendor contracts in the small office space Mrs. Chun had provided her when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something made her answer. Hello, Miss Washington. This is Charles Wyndham from the National Arts Foundation. Nina's pen clattered to the desk. Charles Wyndham, the man who had stood and applauded after her impromptu performance at Bellamy's estate. The man whose approval had meant more to her in that moment than all the other applause combined. Mr. Wyndham, she managed, her voice surprisingly steady. How did you get this number? I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've been unable to stop thinking about your performance at the Bellamy estate. I wonder if you might have time to meet with me? I have a proposition that I believe could be of mutual interest. Nina's heart began to race. In the music world, Charles Wyndham was legend, a man who had launched the careers of internationally acclaimed musicians, composers, and conductors. Artists spoke his name with the kind of reverence usually reserved for deities. I'm not sure what you could possibly want to discuss with me, Nina said, though even as the words left her mouth, a dangerous hope began to bloom in her chest. Miss Washington, what I witnessed 2 weeks ago was extraordinary. Not just technically proficient, though your technique is impressive, but emotionally profound. Art that moves people. Art that changes them. He paused. I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might allow you to explore your gifts more fully. Nina closed her eyes, remembering the feel of those piano keys beneath her fingers the moment when the music had poured out of her like a river finding the sea. Mr. Wyndham, I appreciate the call, but I think there might be some misunderstanding. I'm not a professional musician. I'm a catering coordinator. Yes, he said gently. I'm aware of your current employment. I'm also aware that you were accepted to Juilliard and forced to decline for financial reasons. I'm aware that you've been supporting your family while sacrificing your own artistic development. And I'm aware that what you did at that party was not the work of someone who has given up on music. It was the work of someone who has been forced to put music aside temporarily. Nina's breath caught. He'd done his research. How do you? Miss Washington, it's my job to find exceptional talent, wherever it might be hiding. And make no mistake, you are exceptional. The question is whether you're ready to do something about it. Nina looked around the small office, at the vendor contracts and event timelines that had become her life. It was honest work, and it paid better than waiting tables, but it wasn't who she was meant to be. She'd known that even as she'd gratefully accepted Mrs. Chen's offer. What kind of opportunities? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The foundation has several programs designed to support artists who show exceptional promise but lack traditional pathways to development. Mentorships, performance opportunities, even financial support for education. But most importantly, we provide a community of artists who understand that talent without opportunity is simply unused potential. Nina's hands were trembling now. This was the conversation she'd dreamed of having as a teenager, the phone call that could change everything. But she'd learned not to trust dreams that seemed too good to be true. Mr. Wyndham, I appreciate the offer, but my life is complicated. I have responsibilities. I understand completely. And I'm not asking you to abandon those responsibilities. What I'm suggesting is that you don't have to choose between supporting your family and nurturing your talent. There are ways to do both if you're willing to take a leap of faith. Nina closed her eyes, seeing Maya's face as she studied for her nursing exam. Thinking of all the sacrifices her sister had made to support Nina's dreams before reality forced them both to be practical. What would you need from me? Nina asked. Just a meeting. 1 hour of your time to discuss possibilities. No commitments, no obligations. Just a conversation between two people who understand that art matters. Nina looked at her calendar, seeing the comfortable routine of vendor meetings and event planning that had become her new normal. Safe, predictable, sufficient, but not the life she'd imagined for herself when she was 19 and believed anything was possible. When, she heard herself say, tomorrow, if you're available. My office at 2 o'clock. After Nina hung up, she sat in her small office for a long time, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and tell her the whole conversation had been a mistake. But deep down, she knew this moment had been building since the night she'd played at Bellamy's estate. The music she'd released that night hadn't just been a response to humiliation. It had been a declaration, a statement that she was still here, still fighting, still hoping. The question now was whether she was brave enough to fight for something more than just survival. That evening, Nina found Maya hunched over her nursing textbooks at their tiny kitchen table, highlighter marks covering her hands like colorful scars. The sight made Nina's chest tight with emotion. Maya had given up so much to support Nina's dreams, and when those dreams became impossible, she'd pivoted to her own career with the kind of determination that both inspired and humbled Nina. Maya, Nina said, sitting across from her sister. I need to tell you something. Maya looked up, immediately alert to the serious tone in Nina's voice. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think so. Nina took a breath. Charles Wyndham from the National Arts Foundation called me today. Maya's eyes widened. Even she knew that name. The Charles Wyndham? The guy who's like the most important person in classical music? He wants to meet with me. Tomorrow. He thinks. Nina struggled to find the words. He thinks I might have opportunities. Real opportunities. Maya set down her highlighter, her full attention now focused on her sister. Nina, that's incredible. What kind of opportunities? I don't know yet. That's what the meeting is about. Nina hesitated. But Maya, if something comes of this, it might mean changes. Big changes. And I know you're counting on me to help with your expenses while you finish school. Maya reached across the table and grabbed Nina's hands, stopping her mid-sentence. Nina Washington, if you're about to tell me that you're considering turning down an opportunity from Charles Wyndham because you're worried about my nursing school expenses, I will personally drive you to that meeting and lock you in his office until you accept whatever he's offering. But the money I'm making now will be there if this doesn't work out. But opportunities like this, they don't come twice. Maya's eyes were fierce with conviction. Do you remember what you used to tell me when we were kids and I was afraid to try new things? Nina smiled despite her anxiety. That the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. Exactly. And Nina, I've watched you sacrifice everything for this family. For Mom's medical bills, for my education, for everyone except yourself. If this is your chance to finally put yourself first, then you have to take it. That night, Nina lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing between hope and terror. Tomorrow's meeting could change everything. Or it could be a polite rejection that would confirm what part of her had always feared. That talent without connections, without the right background or financial resources, simply wasn't enough in a world that valued pedigree as much as ability. But as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking not about the potential for disappointment, but about the feeling of her fingers on those piano keys at Bellamy's estate. The moment when the music had poured out of her like something that had been waiting her entire life to be released. Maybe Maya was right. Maybe the biggest risk was not taking any risks at all. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for Nina Washington to stop playing it safe. Nina stood in front of the gleaming glass tower that housed the National Arts Foundation, her palms sweaty despite the cool October air. The building stretched 40 stories into the Manhattan sky, its facade reflecting the clouds like a massive mirror that seemed to ask, "Are you sure you belong here?" She'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on a simple black dress that Maya had insisted looked professional but artistic. Whatever that meant, Nina felt like a fraud in any outfit that wasn't her catering uniform. But Maya had threatened bodily harm if Nina showed up to meet Charles Wyndham in anything less than her best. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with contemporary art installations that probably cost more than Nina's annual salary. She gave her name to the receptionist, an impeccably dressed woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, and tried not to fidget while she waited. "Miss Washington," a voice called from behind her. Nina turned to see Charles Wyndham approaching, and she was struck by how different he seemed from the reserved figure she'd glimpsed at Bellamy's estate. Here, in his own environment, he radiated the kind of quiet authority that came from years of shaping the cultural landscape. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth underneath. "Mr. Wyndham," Nina said, extending her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Please call me Charles. And thank you for coming. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." Nina almost laughed. She'd taken 3 different subway lines and walked 6 blocks because she couldn't afford a taxi, but she simply smiled and said, "Not at all." Charles led her to an elevator that whisked them up to the 35th floor. His office was nothing like what Nina had expected. Instead of the sterile corporate environment she'd imagined, it was warm and inviting, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Central Park. The walls were lined with photographs of musicians and composers, some famous, others unknown to Nina but clearly cherished by Charles. "Please, sit anywhere you're comfortable," Charles said, gesturing to a seating area with comfortable chairs arranged around a low table. "Can I offer you coffee?" "Tea. Coffee would be wonderful," Nina said, grateful for something to do with her hands. As Charles prepared coffee from what looked like a professional-grade espresso machine, Nina studied the photographs on his walls. There were pictures of him with Yo-Yo Ma, with Leonard Bernstein, with musicians she recognized and dozens she didn't. But what struck her most were the smaller photos scattered among the famous faces. Young people, some barely out of their teens, all holding instruments or standing at pianos, all beaming with the kind of joy that comes from being truly seen and supported. "Those are some of my proudest achievements," Charles said, following her gaze as he handed her a cup of perfectly prepared coffee. "Young artists who might never have had a platform without some help along the way." Nina accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. It was better than anything she'd ever tasted. Even the coffee at Bellamy's estate hadn't been this good. "Now then," Charles said, settling into the chair across from her, "let me tell you why I asked you here." Nina nodded, trying to project confidence while her heart hammered against her ribs. "What I witnessed at the Bellamy estate was exceptional, but it was also heartbreaking." Charles began. I saw an artist of extraordinary ability performing for an audience that had no understanding of what they were experiencing. It was like watching someone use a Stradivarius as kindling. Nina felt heat creep up her neck. Charles, she corrected herself. I appreciate the compliment, but I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting. What I'm suggesting, Charles said, leaning forward slightly, is that you stop hiding your light under a bushel. The foundation has a program called the Emerging Artists Initiative. It's designed specifically for individuals like yourself, those who possess exceptional talent but lack the traditional pathways to artistic development. Nina's coffee cup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. What does that mean exactly? Charles stood and walked to his desk, returning with a thick folder. It means mentorship with world-class musicians. It means performance opportunities at venues that can launch careers. It means financial support that allows you to focus on your artistry without worrying about survival. He opened the folder and slid it across the table to Nina. Inside were photographs of concert halls, program notes from performances, and testimonials from artists who had gone through the program. Nina recognized some of the names. Musicians she'd heard on the radio, seen on television, artists who were living the life she'd once dreamed of. This is incredible, Nina whispered, turning the pages. But I don't understand why you would offer this to me. You heard me play once, for 3 minutes, under terrible circumstances. Nina, Charles said gently, in my 30 years in this business, I've learned to recognize something that can't be taught, can't be manufactured, and can't be faked. You have what we call the gift, not just technical ability, though yours is impressive, but the ability to move people, to make them feel something profound through your music. That night at Bellamy's, you took a moment of cruelty and transformed it into something beautiful. That's not just talent, that's artistry. Nina stared at the folder, her vision blurring slightly. This was everything she dreamed of as a young woman. Everything she'd been forced to abandon when real life intruded on her fantasies. But it felt too good to be true, too perfect to be real. What would be expected of me? She asked. The program is intensive, Charles admitted. You'd be working with some of the most demanding musicians in the world. There would be performances, competitions, evaluations. It's not easy, and it's not guaranteed. But for the right person, it can be life-changing. Nina thought about Maya, about the rent payments and the responsibilities that had shaped her life for the past 3 years. I have obligations. Family obligations. The program includes a stipend, Charles said quietly. Enough to cover living expenses, and then some. We believe that artists shouldn't have to choose between pursuing their passion and taking care of their families. Nina's breath caught. How much? Charles named a figure that made Nina's head spin. It was more than she'd made in her best year of combining multiple jobs. It was enough to support Maya through nursing school, enough to finally catch up on all the bills that had been haunting them, enough to live like a human being instead of just surviving. There's one condition, Charles continued. You'd need to be able to commit fully. The program requires significant time and energy. You couldn't continue your current job. Nina's practical side kicked in immediately. What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail? Then you'll have tried, Charles said simply, and you'll have learned something about yourself in the process. But Nina, I've been doing this for 3 decades. I don't make offers lightly. I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't believe in your potential. Nina looked out the window at Central Park, watching tiny figures move along the paths like ants navigating their own complicated lives. Somewhere down there, people were making safe choices, practical decisions, choosing security over dreams. And 3 weeks ago, she would have been one of them. How long do I have to decide? She asked. The next cohort begins in 3 weeks, Charles said. I need an answer by Friday. 2 days. Nina felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, and Charles Wyndham was asking her to jump without knowing if there was water below or jagged rocks. Can I ask you something? Nina said. Of course. Why do you do this? You could just work with established artists, people who are already successful. Why take risks on unknowns like me? Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city beyond his windows. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful personal experience. Because I know what it's like to have dreams that feel impossible, he said finally. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My father was a mechanic, my mother cleaned houses. When I told them I wanted to work in music, they thought I'd lost my mind. It took one person, my high school music teacher. to believe in me enough to help me find scholarships, to write letters of recommendation, to convince me that my dreams weren't ridiculous. He turned back to Nina, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. That teacher changed my life. Now I try to be that person for others. Because talent without opportunity is just unused potential, and the world has enough unused potential. Nina felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. This man, this powerful, influential man, understood something about her story that she'd never expected anyone to comprehend. Nina, Charles said softly, I can't promise you that this path will be easy. Art is never easy. But I can promise you that if you're willing to work, if you're willing to push yourself beyond what you think you're capable of, this program will change your life. Nina looked down at the folder in her hands, at the photographs of young artists who had taken the same leap she was being asked to take. Some of them looked like her, young, uncertain, maybe a little scared. But all of them looked like they were exactly where they belonged. I need to talk to my sister, Nina said. Of course. And Nina. Charles stood and extended his hand. Whatever you decide, thank you for coming today. It's been a privilege to meet you properly. As Nina rode the subway back to her apartment, the folder clutched against her chest like a life preserver. She felt like she was living in a dream. 3 weeks ago, she'd been invisible, serving champagne to people who saw her as furniture. Now she was being offered the chance to study with master musicians, to perform on stages she'd only dreamed of, to finally be the artist she'd always known she could be. But dreams, Nina had learned, were dangerous things. They could lift you up or destroy you, depending on how tightly you held on to them. The question was she brave enough to dream again? Nina burst through the door of her apartment like a hurricane. The folder from Charles Wyndham clutched in her hands, and her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror. Maya looked up from her textbooks, immediately alert to her sister's emotional state. How did it go? Maya asked, setting down her highlighter. Nina slumped into the chair across from her sister and slid the folder across the table. Look at this. Maya opened the folder and began reading, her eyes growing wider with each page. Nina, this is incredible. They want to give you a full scholarship, and a stipend, and performance opportunities. She looked up, her face glowing with excitement. This is it. This is your chance. Maya, I can't, Nina said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. This is too big, too risky. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? What if? Stop. Maya's voice was firm, cutting through Nina's spiral of anxiety. Just stop for a minute and listen to yourself. You're talking about an opportunity that most musicians would kill for, and you're looking for reasons to say no. Nina buried her face in her hands. It's not that simple. This is Charles Wyndham we're talking about. He works with the best of the best. I'm a catering coordinator who plays piano in her spare time. No, Maya said, her voice growing more intense. You're a musician who's been forced to work catering to survive. There's a difference, and you know it. Nina looked up at her sister, seeing the fierce determination in Maya's eyes that had carried her through nursing school despite every obstacle life had thrown at them. What if I mess this up? Nina whispered. What if I disappoint him? What if I disappoint you? Maya reached across the table and took Nina's hands. Do you remember what you used to tell me when I was scared about starting nursing school? When I said I wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough? Nina managed a small smile. That you couldn't fail at something you never tried. Exactly. And now I'm saying the same thing to you. Maya squeezed her hands. Nina, I've watched you sacrifice everything for this family. You gave up Juilliard for mom's medical bills. You've worked jobs you hated to support my education. You've put everyone else's dreams ahead of your own for years. When do you get to be selfish? When do you get to choose yourself? Nina felt tears starting to build behind her eyes. But what about you? What about your expenses? What about? I'll figure it out, Maya said firmly. I'm almost done with school anyway. I can take out loans if I need to. I can work extra shifts. I can do whatever it takes. But Nina, I cannot watch you turn down the opportunity of a lifetime because you're worried about me. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure Nina was brave enough to cross. Tell me about him, Maya said finally. Charles Wyndham. What was he like? Nina closed her eyes, remembering the warmth in Charles's office, the photographs on his walls, the genuine care in his voice when he talked about supporting young artists. He understood, Nina said softly. He understood what it's like to come from nothing and dream of something more. He understood what it's like to have talent, but no opportunities. And Maya, when he talked about my music, he made me remember who I used to be, who I could still be. Maya smiled. That sounds like someone worth taking a risk for. That evening, Nina found herself walking through the city streets, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. She ended up in Central Park, on a bench not far from the building where she'd met with Charles. The autumn air was crisp, and families were walking by with children who laughed without thinking about rent or medical bills or deferred dreams. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marco. How did the meeting go? Dying to know. Nina stared at the phone for a long moment before typing back. It went well. Really well. I'll call you tomorrow. But before she could put the phone away, it rang. The caller ID made her stomach drop. Mrs. Chun, Prestige Catering. Hello, Mrs. Chun. Nina answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Nina, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to discuss the Morrison wedding next month. The client specifically requested you to coordinate the entertainment, and they're willing to pay a premium for your services. Nina closed her eyes. Mrs. Chun was offering her more money, more responsibility, more security. It was the safe choice, the practical choice, the smart choice. Mrs. Chun, I appreciate the offer, but I need to tell you something. I've been offered an opportunity that might require me to step away from catering. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I see. Well, Nina, I can't say I'm surprised. I've known since the Bellamy incident that you were destined for bigger things. What kind of opportunity? Nina found herself telling Mrs. Chun about the meeting with Charles Wyndham, about the Emerging Artists Initiative, about the choice she was facing. As she spoke, she realized that saying it out loud made it feel more real, more possible. Nina, Mrs. Chun said when Nina finished. In my 20 years in business, I've learned that opportunities like this don't come twice. If you don't take this chance, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. But I'd be leaving you short-staffed. I'll manage. Good employees are replaceable. Exceptional talent is not. Take the chance, Nina. Take it and don't look back. After Nina hung up, she sat on the bench for a long time, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the growing darkness. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Miss Washington, this is Charles Wyndham. I hope you don't mind that I'm reaching out, but I wanted you to know that whatever you decide, it's been an honor to meet you. Your music has stayed with me since that night at Bellamy's, and I believe you have the power to move the world. Trust yourself. Charles. Nina read the message 3 times, each reading making her heart race a little faster. This man, this important, influential man, believed in her. More than that, he saw her potential not just as a musician, but as an artist who could make a difference. She thought about Grayson Bellamy, about the moment when he'd tried to humiliate her and she'd responded with music instead of anger. She thought about the applause that had followed, the way Charles had stood up in a room full of people who didn't understand what they'd just witnessed. She thought about the keyboard in her apartment, covered by a bedsheet, waiting for her to remember who she used to be. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do. Nina pulled out her phone and dialed Charles's number. He answered on the second ring. Charles, it's Nina Washington. Nina, I'm so glad you called. Have you had time to think about our conversation? I have, Nina said, her voice growing stronger with each word. And I want to do it. I want to accept your offer. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a moment, and Nina wondered if she'd made a mistake. Then Charles's voice came through, warm with genuine pleasure. Nina, that's wonderful news. I'm thrilled. We're going to do great things together. Charles, Nina said, I need you to know something. I'm scared. I'm terrified, actually. But I'm also more excited than I've been in years. That's exactly how you should feel, Charles said. Fear and excitement often go hand in hand when we're about to do something that matters. Nina, you're about to begin the most challenging and rewarding journey of your life. And I couldn't be more honored to be part of it. As Nina walked home through the city streets, she felt like she was floating. The world looked different somehow, brighter, more full of possibility. She was still the same person who had served champagne at Grayson Bellamy's party 3 weeks ago, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer playing it safe. She was no longer content to be invisible. Nina Washington was ready to be seen. And the world, she realized, was about to discover what she was truly capable of. 6 months later, Nina stood in the wings of Lincoln Center's Alice Tully Hall, her hands trembling as she listened to the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain. Tonight was her debut performance as part of the Emerging Artists Initiative, a solo recital that would be attended by critics, talent scouts, and some of the most influential people in the classical music world. The past 6 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of her life. Under Charles's guidance and the mentorship of Master Professor Elena Vasquez, a legendary pianist who had initially terrified Nina with her demanding perfectionism, Nina had pushed herself beyond what she thought possible. Her technique had become more refined, her musical understanding deeper, her confidence stronger. But tonight felt different. Tonight wasn't just about proving herself to the music world. It was about proving to herself that the leap of faith she'd taken had been worth it. "You're going to be magnificent," came a familiar voice behind her. Nina turned to see Charles approaching, impeccable as always in his evening wear, but his eyes warm with the kind of paternal pride that made Nina's chest tight with emotion. "I'm terrified," Nina admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Charles said with a smile. "If you weren't nervous, I'd be worried. Nerves mean you care, that this matters to you. And Nina, after watching you work these past 6 months, I can tell you with complete confidence that you are ready for this." Nina looked out at the stage, at the gleaming Steinway that waited for her like an old friend. It was different from the piano at Bellamy's estate. This one was built for artistry, not for show. This one was waiting to help her tell her story. "Charles," Nina said, turning back to him, "I need to tell you something. When I first agreed to this program, I thought it was about proving that I belonged in this world. But I realize now that it's about something else entirely." "What's that?" "It's about proving that this world needs people like me. People who come from nothing, who've struggled, who've been overlooked. Our music is different because our stories are different. And those stories matter." Charles nodded, his expression serious. "They do matter, Nina. More than you know. Now go out there and tell yours." As Nina walked onto the stage, the lights momentarily blinded her. But as her eyes adjusted, she began to make out faces in the audience. Maya was in the third row, beaming with pride. Marco had somehow managed to get the night off and was sitting next to her, looking uncomfortable in his borrowed suit, but grinning widely. And there, in the back corner of the hall, she spotted a face that made her heart stop for a moment. Grayson Bellamy sat with his usual entourage, his expression unreadable. For a second, Nina felt the old fear creep up her spine. The fear of being humiliated, of being reduced to entertainment for the amusement of people who would never see her as an equal. But then she remembered who she was now. She wasn't the invisible waitress anymore. She was Nina Washington, pianist, artist, and someone who had earned her place on this stage through talent, hard work, and the courage to believe in herself. Nina sat at the piano bench and adjusted her position, feeling the familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingers. The audience grew quiet, that particular hush that falls over a concert hall when something important is about to happen. She began with Chopin, a nocturne that had been one of the first pieces she'd mastered under Professor Vasquez's guidance. The notes flowed from her fingers like water, each phrase carefully shaped and emotionally honest. But this was just the warm-up, the appetizer before the main course. For her centerpiece, Nina had chosen to perform her own composition, something she'd been working on for months with the encouragement of her mentors. It was a piece that told the story of her journey, the dreams deferred, the sacrifices made, the moment when everything changed, and the hope that had carried her to this stage. As she transitioned into her original work, Nina felt the same sensation she'd experienced that night at Bellamy's estate. The feeling of the music pouring out of her like something that had been waiting her entire life to be heard. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't playing in response to humiliation or anger. She was playing from a place of strength, of self-knowledge, of artistic maturity that had been earned through months of intensive study and personal growth. The music swelled and danced, painting pictures of subway rides to multiple jobs, of late nights spent worrying about rent, of the moment when she'd thought her dreams were impossible, and finally, of the realization that some dreams are worth fighting for no matter how difficult the path becomes. When the final notes faded into silence, the hush that followed was profound. Nina remained seated at the piano, her eyes closed, feeling the last reverberations of her music settle into the acoustics of the hall. Then the applause began. It started slowly, almost tentatively, but quickly grew into something thunderous. Nina opened her eyes to see the entire audience on their feet. Critics who rarely showed emotion, seasoned musicians who had heard everything, young music students who were seeing their own dreams reflected in her performance. Maya was crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth in amazement. Marco was applauding so enthusiastically that Nina was worried he might hurt himself. Charles stood near the side of the hall, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a mentor who has seen their student exceed even their highest expectations. But it was the figure in the back corner that caught Nina's attention. Grayson Bellamy was standing with the rest of the audience, his applause genuine, his expression one of what looked like wonder mixed with something that might have been shame. As the applause finally began to die down, Nina stood and took her bow. But as she straightened, she found herself looking directly at Bellamy. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded hall. And in that moment, Nina saw something she never expected to see in his gaze: respect. Later, at the reception following the performance, Nina found herself surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her, to discuss future opportunities, to be associated with what everyone seemed to recognize as a significant artistic debut. Critics were comparing her to established masters, talent scouts were discussing recording contracts, and fellow musicians were treating her as a peer rather than a curiosity. Nina. Maya pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around her sister. That was incredible. I've never heard you play like that. That's because I've never felt like that before, Nina replied, holding her sister tight. Maya, I couldn't have done this without you. Without your support, your belief in me. Stop, Maya said, pulling back with tears in her eyes. You did this. You earned this. I'm just proud to be your sister. Marco appeared at Nina's elbow, still looking slightly overwhelmed by the elegant surroundings. Mija, that was something else. I've been telling everyone that I knew you when you were just serving champagne to rich people. Nina laughed, feeling giddy with relief and accomplishment. Marco, you were the first person to stand up for me that night. You'll always be family to me. Miss Washington. Nina turned to find a well-dressed woman approaching with a business card in her hand. I'm Sarah Mitchell from Carnegie Hall. We'd like to discuss some opportunities for future performances. As Nina accepted the card, she felt a surreal sense of displacement. 6 months ago, she'd been invisible. Tonight, she was being offered performance opportunities at one of the most prestigious venues in the world. Miss Washington. The voice was familiar, but it took Nina a moment to process that Grayson Bellamy was standing before her, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked like humility. The conversations around them quieted as people noticed the interaction. Nina felt Maya tense beside her, but Nina herself felt strangely calm. Mr. Bellamy, she said evenly. I wanted to apologize, Bellamy said, his voice low enough that only Nina and those immediately around her could hear. For what happened at my estate. For how I treated you. It was inexcusable. Nina studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation. But what she saw instead was genuine remorse, the kind that comes from being forced to confront an ugly truth about yourself. Apology accepted, Nina said simply. What you did tonight, Bellamy continued, it was extraordinary. I wanted you to know that I understand now what I was too ignorant to see before. You're not just talented, you're an artist in the truest sense of the word. Nina nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. Thank you. That means more than you know. As Bellamy moved away, Charles appeared at Nina's side. How does it feel? He asked. Nina looked around the reception, at the critics taking notes, at the fellow musicians treating her as an equal, at Maya and Marco beaming with pride, at the business cards accumulating in her hand from venues and organizations that wanted to work with her. It feels like the beginning, Nina said. Like everything up until now was just preparation for whatever comes next. Charles smiled. That's exactly what it is. Nina, you've just announced yourself to the music world in the most spectacular way possible. Your life is about to change in ways you can't even imagine yet. Nina thought about the keyboard in her old apartment, covered by a bedsheet, waiting for someone to remember its purpose. She thought about the girl who had served champagne to people who couldn't see her worth. She thought about the moment when she decided to stop hiding and start living. Charles, she said, I need to ask you something. That night at Bellamy's estate, when you first heard me play, did you know this would happen? Did you know it would lead to this? Charles was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I knew you had exceptional talent, he said finally. But what I witnessed tonight went beyond talent. Tonight, you showed the world that you're not just a skilled musician. You're an artist with something important to say. And that, Nina, is something that can't be taught or manufactured. That's something you had to discover for yourself. As the reception began to wind down and Nina started to collect the dozens of business cards and contact information she'd been given, she realized that Charles was right. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. But more importantly, she had changed. The frightened woman who had served champagne while dreaming of something more was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that dreams aren't fragile things to be protected. They're powerful forces that can reshape reality if you're brave enough to pursue them. Nina Washington was no longer hiding her light under a bushel. She was ready to illuminate the world. And as she walked out of Lincoln Center into the New York night, arm in arm with Maya and Marco, with Charles walking beside them discussing the dozens of opportunities that would be coming her way in the weeks ahead, Nina felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she was finally, truly home. The story of the invisible waitress was over. The story of Nina Washington, the artist, was just beginning. And the world was ready to listen. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.